Hello, it's Aaron. Welcome back to the podcast. One of the things that everybody likes to discuss these days is the cost of housing. It's long been astronomically expensive to live in places like San Francisco and New York, but especially during the pandemic, we saw a big run up in housing prices in a lot of places. I noticed that even places like Flint, Michigan, and Youngstown, Ohio, that were just basket case economies, we're seeing huge increases in home prices. A friend of mine, his mother died. She lived in Saginaw, Michigan. There was a bidding war over her house in Saginaw, and the prices haven't come down at all. They've continued to be high. And so, what's going on? How do we explain this? And what do we do about it? And so, I have a very special guest to help us understand that today, and that's Adam Ozimek, who is the chief economist at the Economic Innovation Group. EIG, I don't know what they call themselves. I would describe them as a bipartisan think tank. They are the people who I think came up with the idea of opportunity zones. If you know about that, they do a lot of really interesting research and maps on distressed communities. There's a lot of great stuff coming out of there, very well respected. So, Adam, thank you for joining me.
Thanks for being or for inviting me, Aaron. Glad to be here.
How would you describe the state of the housing market? Like, is it really expensive? Are we off base? You hear about this. Like, what are the facts on housing prices in America?
Yeah, when it comes to housing, I find it very useful to divide it into two sort of time scales. There's the what is the cyclical state of the housing market, and where does that stand, and then where is the sort of long run structural state of the housing market. Uh, Unfortunately, both of them are currently pointing in the direction of expensive right now. We have had a long run problem with housing construction where housing has not kept up with demand. That is a long running, slow moving problem that started decades ago and has gotten slowly worse. And there are a lot of factors behind that that we can talk about. And then you have this sort of post pandemic crunch. I think there's a variety of drivers here. Some of it is working out. You've got more housing construction over the last 2 years was relatively robust. You have, especially in some of those markets that have built more, you have had rent growth slow. I think that's going to help and continue to help a little bit, but part of it is I believe remote work has played a role here as well. Some of my research has shown this. Places that saw a big increase in remote work saw more demand for housing. In particular, I think it has caused people to want their own households. So if you used to have four roommates living together and one of them went remote, that person might not want to share a house with four people. They may want to move out, have their own spot. It sort of increases the demand for space. So it also changes where people want to live. So you have people moving to places that were previously more affordable and are now less affordable as the population sort of patterns shift. You had relatively less demand in the dense urban cores and more demand in the suburbs and the lower cost areas outside of major metropolitan areas. So that might explain part of why you see some places which have typically been more affordable suddenly find their affordability erode.
Yeah. Now, I know a lot of housing discourse is shaped by Brooklyn and San Francisco and Washington, D.C., and Los Angeles, and a few places where the journalistic class lives. And so the problems of those places dominate the airwaves in a sense, just like we're all talking about crime in these same cities, or how when Joe Biden called LaGuardia a third world airport, it was like a big deal. Whereas if somebody said Indianapolis had a third world airport, which we actually have the best airport for our size in the country, not like, but nobody would care. But when it's in New York City, all of a sudden people care. I've been thinking about it more in terms of places like Indianapolis, where I live, because housing prices have gone up a lot, and it's not just because of inflation. One of the things that um, people use to sort of measure housing is the price to income ratio. So basically, the median or average price of a house divided by the median income. With this rule of thumb, I think people say that you shouldn't spend more. You should spend more like three times your income on a house. 10 years ago, a decade ago, in 2015, the price to income ratio for housing in Indianapolis Metro was 2.9. Today, it's 4.1. So we've gone up 40% in a decade in terms of prices relative to income. But we didn't seem to have a spike in population. I mean, we've grown, but we haven't grown all that much. It's not like when we all of a sudden we were not one of these Zoom towns. We had some maybe
Right.
people move here, but it's not like our population growth exploded overnight. There weren't any big changes in like zoning. I can't figure out exactly what's going on in a place like Indianapolis. Do you have any thoughts on that?
So I think, Indianapolis, you tell me, but is one of the more successful parts of the Rust Belt in terms of like,
Yeah.
Indiana has done relatively well growth wise. So I'm gonna guess there's an Indiana specific factor to some extent that's part of it. But then there are, national factors. You have construction is an industry with really low productivity growth. People are not getting any better at building houses, or actually, depending on the measure you look at, maybe getting worse at it over time. You also have zoning is obviously another big part of this, where it becomes harder to build. In particular, it becomes harder to build entry level homes, right? Smaller homes, and so not only does that reduce the supply of housing, which makes housing more expensive, but it sort of cuts off the lower end of the spectrum, and so that's going to push median prices up more than it would that if you just couldn't build houses of big houses, right? Then that might push the
Mm.
median down a little bit. So it's that decline of entry level houses. It's low productivity in construction. All those things kind of add up, and they all kind of work together. Zoning is a factor for low productivity in construction, and also a big part of the reason why they don't build small houses anymore. So I think those are the sort of structural, longer running things that are eroding affordability.
Yeah, I want to go through some of the popular factors and maybe dive in on them and just get your take on each of these. Now, one is construction cost. You mentioned construction was a low productivity growth industry, but it seems that it's become dramatically more expensive to build homes in the relatively near recent past. So again, I remember pre-housing crash, which been at least 2 decades ago now. Okay, so it's there is some inflation here to be sure. You could buy a house from an entry level home production company for less than $100,000 before you did any upgrades on it. Now, supposedly, I'm hearing it costs 350 to 400,000 to build a single family home in in our area. The cheapest I've ever heard of is a medical device company called Cook Group, very civically minded, privately held company here. They have a plant in Spencer, Indiana, which is a small town like an hour from Indianapolis, low cost community. They needed housing for their employees, so they built their own subdivision. So this is a large company with low cost of capital and all of that. They were building a significant number of them, so they had some economies of scale, and their cost was over $200,000 per house, and that's building without even any, I'd say, below modern standards. So, for example, there were drainage ditches on the residential street. They didn't even have storm drains. They didn't have any sidewalks. You certainly can't do that in suburbia, most of suburban America today, at least outside the South, you can't. And of course, they're small vinyl houses. Did something drive the cost of construction up a lot in the recent past? Like, is it literally just a productivity thing or something else?
So, I mean, compared to pre-pandemic, you did have a like a huge surge in input costs. It became harder to get just about anything, and not all of those costs have come back down to earth. You do have the even when you account for the cost of all the inputs you put together, though, it still is more expensive to build a house these days. And it to be honest, it's mysterious. There's no like canonical paper or analysis that really gets at what is it that's driving productivity costs up or productivity down and costs up in housing. You have some theories, for example, greater safety regulations in housing. You have to dot more I's, cross more T's, do more paperwork, that sort of thing. You can see, the benefit of that is obviously the injury rates have gone down in construction, but that's something that's possibly driving the cost up. Another factor is that you don't have as many large companies in construction as you do. It's more dominated by smaller companies, and so in the rest of the economy, the big companies are often ones that are uh, driving productivity gains or economies of scale, for example, and you just don't have that as much. It becomes difficult to grow a large company when it's hard to navigate different zoning regimes. So, for example, here in Pennsylvania, I own a bowling alley here, and I was going to build another bowling alley in a neighboring county, and we were told by our construction partners, like, oh, we should hire a local architect, um, and I, or a local architect. And I thought, why do we need that? They said, well, we need someone who can navigate the local permitting permission process. They need to know, who the people are that are going to need to approve this locally, who the blockers are. They're going to need to coordinate with them and have a good relationship with them. I'm talking one county over, right? And so, like, this need to have these relationships and to understand these different regulatory regimes from place to place, those are sand in the gears for larger companies. And so you do have this sort of uh, missing large firms that could be helpful in terms of reducing costs and finding efficiencies and things like that. So I think that's one of the other factors, but it's definitely, you should not feel like there is some hidden uh, explainable truth out there on this that you haven't come across yet. It's just there's quite a bit of mystery still in terms of what's causing the productivity problems.
Yeah, Brian Potter, who writes the great construction physics site, put together a pie chart of the components, cost breakdown of the components of a house. And there isn't like there's just one thing that takes up most of it. There's lots and lots of things. Even like the framing, which might be the biggest, is like 15% of the cost of a house or something. So it's not like, oh, if we just fix the framing problem, our problems are solved. Or if we just fix the foundation problems, it's everything. And I've done some repairs on my house. I had to get a new hot water heater. It was like $1,800, and I'm like, that's crazy that it's $1,800. It used to be like $800, and it's not like I talk to people. I'm like, am I getting ripped off? Like, no, that's the going rate. Or it's like, you put in a new HVAC. It's like, whoa, what the heck just happened? That all these things are so crazy. This is one that is a little strange, and I have a theory on some of that. Maybe we'll come back to later. So we know there's a construction cost issue with just building. What about zoning? And when I put in to say zoning, I use that just as a holistic heading for all of the rules that you have to follow to be allowed to build something. So there's
Right.
technically zoning basically regulates land use, essentially what sorts of things that you can build, and what can you build a car wash there? Can you build a factory there? Can you build a house there? And some things about the setbacks. And you get the building codes that are like, here's the kind of wiring you've got to use, and here's all these different rules of egress and emergency exits and all these things like that. And then there's different environmental laws and other permitting things. I kind of put that all under zoning. And this is a huge issue in certain parts of the country, like California. So, in most of the country, I assume it's most of the country, certainly here in Indiana, we can do what's called build by right. So, basically, a developer can come in, look up the zoning, look up the building codes, and if they design something that meets them, then they're allowed to build. The government actually can't stop them. If the government says we're not going to approve your development, they can go to court and get a court order to get them done, which actually had happened here in Indiana. You go to San Francisco, there's no as of right development, is my understanding. So, in a sense, you need the arbitrary approval of the city to do anything. And and it's not just that the zoning is there, but it's all of these NIMBYs, not in my backyard people and opponents, and this. It's this whole culture that they've developed in places like Oregon and California that basically allow anybody who wants to stop a project. Becomes extremely, extremely difficult. What is the theory on? It seems to be a popular theory that zoning is really kind of the master switch that we need to pull on housing. What is your take of zoning and how it applies in different parts of the country in terms of its contribution to housing prices?
Yeah, I think if you go to the big superstar cities, that's where the you're going to find the biggest gap between like the cost of building a housing and how far prices have gone up. So zoning is the most explanatory power in those types of places, but I do think it matters increasingly across the country. Zoning is just getting worse over time. It's becoming more binding in different places. It's slowing down. It's important. I agree that the buy right versus needing a special exception, that is a consequential difference, but there are a variety of other dimensions to it as well. One is, what can you build by right, for example. So in some places you can build single family housing by right, but it's very low density, very large lots. And building an apartment, it then requires either the special exception or can't be done at all. Or you and again, you can always kill projects with minimum lot size restrictions. So it's not simply about, is there something that's by right versus is everything special exception, but what fits under the by right umbrella. Um, the other part of this, I think, is it takes time in a lot of places. The time to build has gone up, and the delays in construction. And if you are a developer, as soon as you own the land and the clock begins ticking, you have a construction loan, and that construction loan, you're paying interest on it. So time for approvals, time to get approvals, the time from the purchase of the property until when the unit is sold, that time is money, and that money increases costs as well. So having a fast approval process, having a certain approval process, those are important dimensions as well. So you want to be able to build with certainty, meaning a greater share of things by right, but you also want to be able to build to whatever density the market demands, and you also want to be able to build relatively quickly. And across all those dimensions, I think things generally gotten worse in large swaths of the country. And again, it's always worse in the big urban areas, right? But in a lot of the country, it's spread out to suburbs and smaller metros and small towns and cities and things like that.
When I lived in Rhode Island, the rule of thumb was it would take you 2 years to get permission to do anything, even if you just wanted to build a house or do a major renovation on your house. And there were any number of regulations like requirements for granite curbing and things like that would raise prices. Even in quote unquote flyover country, I know there's some of this. So Brentwood, Tennessee, which is an affluent suburb of Nashville, supposedly has a 1 acre minimum lot size. So you can't build on anything less than an acre, which is extremely large for an
Yeah,
urban area. It's almost a rural density. And they also effectively have what I would call an urban growth boundary. An urban growth boundary is basically a line that says outside of a certain area, you can't develop any subdivisions or anything like that. You can only have essentially rural agricultural land. They're very
right.
common in like Oregon, but they have them in Lexington, Kentucky. They've got it in Williamson County, where if it's not in a municipality, you need very large, essentially agricultural style plots. I actually think some of the upzoning uh, makes sense. Some of the requirements that have been added make sense in the sense that, like, it used to be you could just build a subdivision and not put in sidewalks and not have to make any infrastructural contributions to the city. And the developer kind of left the city kind of holding the bag on some costs. I think cities have rightly started saying, well, you actually have to pay for this stuff. So the infrastructural standards have gone up a lot. What are called impact fees, which are like, okay, you have to pay us to build the parkland and the arterial streets, have gone up. Now they're kind of crazy in California. I'm not going to defend California, but they're there. And I do think a lot of communities, residential property taxes don't yield enough tax revenue to pay for the services that the people who are going to live in that house are going to bring in. So it incentivizes people to only allow luxury housing that is going to allow it, because affordable housing is a money loser. It's a liability because it's not generating enough tax revenue. I think there are a lot of like nuances of this that even if you don't have crazy zoning, that you can end up with a lot of these little things, some of which I think make perfect sense. Again, we shouldn't be pawning off infrastructure onto the state. The developer should be forced to pay for that up front. But it has made it more and more difficult to build. I think even here in Indianapolis, we've raised our standards for what it takes to get approved. I haven't seen what they would call a vinyl village subdivision in a long time in this metro area. And I don't know if it's because they got banned, but they certainly are not common anymore. And I have another theory on that I'll bring up. But I do think the zoning, to me, it's a huge thing. We have to have more liberalized zoning. Obviously, it's a bigger deal in blue states than a lot of these red states. You know, they're still very permissive. But if you can't get permission to build things and you can't get it quickly, it's just a huge issue. And again, if you're California and you're rich, you can get away with it. Most of the country can't get away with that. And this
Yeah.
seems to have been a big focus of a lot of things. And we'll come back to that, but I'll finish going through the causes. But I agree that zoning, and I think everybody agrees that zoning is a big issue, although how big it is kind of depends on where you are. So I talked about construction costs. We talked about zoning. You can think of those as a little bit of, call them supply side things. The other thing that's sort of a supply side one that's there, the Matt Stoller, the anti-monopoly writer, has made some arguments that diminishing competition in the home building space, combined with changes in the way the financing of home building works through no community banks making these loans, have led to a more monopolistic environment for home building. And the case study I think they used was Dallas. And when I read this, I was intrigued because it seemed very in line with Thomas Philippon's arguments. He's a French economist who wrote an entire book about the United States is actually suffering diminishing competition in many sectors relative to Europe. Like our cell phones are more expensive because we have less competition than Europe. And I think there is some empirical to say that like it is a fragmented industry, but it's more consolidated than it used to be. What do you think of that thesis?
It's interesting because I think that we are sort of like missing firms in the sense that like if it was a normal healthy industry, there would be more firms and that would be competitive, but they would be large firms. That there are a lot of very small builders. What's missing is the big builders. There's an interesting paradox when it comes to the level of competition in the economy, which is that at the national level, if you try to measure the level of competition, it seems like it's going down. But the average local area competition has gone up. And the way this works is more national firms competing in local areas. So if you think about a small town where a Walmart enters, right? Now, the Walmart from the national perspective might look like less competition. It's more market share for one large firm. But for the local area, that can be an important source of competition. And so it's very, I think it's sort of a similar thing going on in construction where it looks like less competition at the local level, but the reality is what's missing is these very large firms. So this is not an obvious application of antitrust here, right? that, oh, what we need to do is break up some big companies. That could make things worse. If it discourages regional companies from becoming national companies or discourages small players from becoming regional players, scale is not the enemy in the construction industry. So, to the extent that there is lack of not enough competition, I agree, but it's really on the entry margin. How do we get more growth? How do we get more new firms? How do we get new firms to become bigger firms? And so I don't think you solve that with sort of like regulatory cludges or antitrust or something like that. I think part of it is, again, goes back to zoning. Zoning becomes something that is an impediment to more regional or national competition. Another factor also, I think, is just low growth. And one of the important drivers of uh, entry in an industry is demand growing and is labor supply growing. Those are two important drivers. And the U.S. On the whole, we've seen lower population growth, we've seen lower labor supply growth, and so and less building getting done. And I think that this reduction in output is just going to make less entry into the industry. And so, what can we do is try to figure out how to just make more growth, more output, more quantity, remove those barriers to growing firms, large firms, entering firms. So there's, I think, some truth in here in that we should be focused on entrepreneurship, competition, firm side things. But I think it's very opposite of the issue that the antitrust people sort of focus on, and their solutions can actually be counterproductive.
Hmm. We'll talk about solutions in a little bit. The one observation I'd make is if you go back to pre housing crash Indianapolis, we were building a lot of these, again, they call them vinyl village subdivisions, entry level subdivisions, prices, some of them from the 80s, kind of crazy, some of them up in the 120s, 140s in terms of this is retail price. And what I believe was the largest developer of that, a local firm. Actually, it operated in many other markets too. They were in Charlotte. CP Morgan was one of the big builders of those. So they went out of business in the housing crash. And I don't think there are any builders in our local market of that type left. I mean, their specialty, their tagline was more square footage for less money. It was an entry level guy. They got blown out in the housing crash, and nobody's started back up in that sector again that I can see. Maybe the financing has changed or whatever, but even the guys who own those firms didn't seem to get back in the game. So it does to me seem like there aren't people building at the low end anymore. Maybe it's just not profitable anymore.
I do think there's something interesting on the financing side of it. I've also heard, again, I haven't seen any papers about this or anything, but I've also heard that it's much more difficult to finance sort of on spec, as they call it. So
Mm.
it used to be like, you're a builder, I'm going to build this neighborhood. Can I borrow money to build the neighborhood? And then we'll sell the houses. And banks now, they want you to like pre-sell the houses. So you want to build a house when it's sold and not before. And that's become harder to finance. I don't know if that's still a shadow of the Great Recession type thing. I don't know if that's bank lending standards or what, but I do think there is something interesting going on there. I think the boom bust cycle of housing can be a problem. And, I think we're still sort of in the shadow of the Great Recession in some ways there.
Yeah. Speaking of the Great Recession, I want to flip because those are kind of all sort of, again, supply side things. I want to switch to demand side equation because this is where it seems like most of the controversies you run into are in this. So one of them is investors. And this seems to be a very common view. Depending on the point of view, it's either Blackstone or BlackRock is buying up all the houses. That's certainly not true, but there has been institutional investment money flowing into the single family homes sector in a way that used to not be the case. I mean, I think prior to the financial crash, single family home rentals were more of a mom and pop local kind of thing. And I know one of the things that happened when there were mass numbers of foreclosures in urban areas that a group of kind of investors came in and just bought all these houses off of banks. And so you go into a place like Baltimore that was like 60% owner occupied, became very rental heavy, and they made a lot of money doing this. And I think it got the attention of some of these big funds. And so now you see large institutional investors that have become backers of companies that are buying them, or otherwise. There's different ones out there, and it's not a gigantic quantity. But when you go into certain local markets like Atlanta, it's tens of thousands of houses that are owned by this, and they're uh, account for 10% or more of all home transactions are now being purchased by institutional investors, which they define as someone who owns 10 or more is the stack asset. Which you say, is that really an institution? Somebody owns 15, maybe not. But there are a lot of people with thousands and thousands of homes. This is one that generates massive controversy. And so I'm wondering what you think of the role of investment property investors, particularly large investors, in going into this.
Yeah, so it's not really changing the demand for housing, right? It's changing the nature of the demand for housing. So you're removing a unit from the owner market and you're putting it on the renter market. So you would expect this to increase prices on the margin and decrease rents on the margin. And empirically, I think that's about what's happened. But I think at less than single digit percentages of the total market, it's not enough to really move the dial. And then in the individual markets where it's more substantial, I think that's what it does. It raises the price a little bit, and it lowers the rent a little bit. But I think this is there's something useful here, which is that gets back to what we were saying earlier. So if you're a builder and you want to build low income housing or affordable housing, um, it can be tough from the financing perspective. Banks don't want to lend on spec. This becomes a way to get more housing built, right? Like, you're going to rent it. There's going to be institutional buyers who are interested in these assets. It like sort of reduces the return on investment needed in order to make this to build the houses. So I think it's a good thing. It helps take care. So one of the arguments you hear is that before the Great Recession, it became very easy to get a sort of low income loan, right? No income tests, like low doc, um, you know, low credit score type of lending became difficult, right? And so one of the arguments is that that's become so much harder these days as a result of post Great Recession banking regulations and changes in banking culture and whatnot. And so you'd be missing this lower end part of the market. Well, it makes sense then for an intermediary to step in there and say, you don't have the credit worthiness to buy a single family home, so I'm going to be the owner and I'm going to rent it to you, right? It's sort of, think of it as an intermediation to help reduce that riskiness that banks are no longer willing to do. To me, it seems like a healthy thing. It seems like a very marginal part of the market. We're still dominated by the small mom and pop landlords. So I don't see this as a macro phenomenon at all. And where it is more common in the local market, again, I see it's trading prices for rents, and I'm not sure that that's a bad deal.
Yeah, well, I think from a standpoint of somebody who's a would-be home buyer, that becomes, a negative. I mean, I personally, when we bought our house, we were the very first showing of this house. We made an immediate full price offer, and they had already received a sight unseen all cash offer from an investor. So, like, I'm personally, that is an event that many people have had, and intuitively, it does seem like that would force the price of housing, for sale housing for would be owners up. And it could bring rents down because it's increasing the supply of rental housing, and in some cases, it may reduce demand for. Maybe if people could buy a nice suburban rent a nice suburban single family home, they wouldn't want to buy it because they don't like the existing apartment complex. So there's a dynamics there. This is one that I find is weird that there are so many people. Maybe I'm overly indexing on the one. Is it Jerusalem Demzis? Is that her name? She wrote this article in the Atlantic, just like this is like a conspiracy theory that these things were. It seems like there's a militant desire by some people to deny that investors could play any role in driving up the price of housing. why are people so sensitive to this? And that
Because
does seem like you get a bit. Yeah, it's like 2%, 5%. It's not. It's something, but it's not much. But I feel like some people are like, no, it's like zero.
well, but it's less than 5%, right? It's like,
Yeah.
like 1% or something like that, less than 1%. So it's a very marginal part of the market. It's just not a macroeconomic story. It doesn't describe the macroeconomic problem that we're facing. And so I think the the passion you're seeing there is that, like, well, we can't don't make this a scapegoat. There's certain kinds of people for whom, like, a problem can only be a problem if there's some corporation on the other end of it to get mad at, right? And so certain people are bringing that kind of instincts to the housing market. And so they're like, well,
Mm.
it's got to be an antitrust problem. It's got to be these greedy corporations. And it's like, okay, there's plenty of mystery in housing. So, like, we can think about lots of different issues, but, like, those are not it. Like, those are not major drivers. And it's sort of a distraction from focusing on the harder problems and the more realistic problems. So I think it's sort of like, I agree there's a frustration there, but the frustration comes from sort of the necessity to try and, like, fit this, square peg into a circle hole. Like, where's the corporate bad guy? If there's not a corporate villain, like, I can't get interested in this story.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I do think in some local markets like Atlanta, when 10% of your transactions are institutional investors, that's something. But here would be the point then I would say on that. If it's not a material factor in the housing market, one way or the other, then why not just ban it and take it off the table?
Well, because, like I said, like, there's a useful case to be made for it, in areas like, in because it's not moving the dial macroeconomically does not mean that it's not beneficial, right? Like I said, you can make the case that this is increasing the supply of housing on net, right? Because these are people who are coming to the market, and many of them are building, and they're making it easier for developers to build, and then to sell the assets, reduces the risk of doing the building itself. So I don't know. I don't see a strong case for banning. I would need to see, like, and also, like, again, I agree that, like, if you're a first time home buyer and you're in a market where institutional buyers have a substantial presence, and that's maybe marginally lifted up the house prices. But again, there's a symmetry here. You can't lift up the house prices without lowering the rents, because you're moving from one part of the market to the other. You're moving from the buy part to the rent part. And so if there's enough of a presence to drive up prices, then there should be enough of a presence to drive down rents. So, I'm not sure that in a transaction that probably is net positive on the whole, and then when you're talking about who wins and who loses, why we should, when those sort of even out, I'm not sure why we should put our feet on the side, or put the weight on the scale of the homeowner versus the renter who would be benefiting there. So the renters are going to be lower income, right? They're going to be people who are younger, starting their families. So, if you're going to make a case for preferencing one group over the other, I don't see neutrality. Let the investors participate in the market seems more than fair.
The one area where I think is kind of interesting is people who are building subdivisions that are being built to rent. So now companies are coming in and saying, we're just going to build the whole subdivision that we're
Yeah,
intending to use as rentals. And again, it's a product that probably is not as common in the market, which is like a high quality single family new home that you can rent. Usually, if you're renting an apartment, or it's not the same product you would buy. The one reason you go into a single family home is there. So this could definitely, and they don't have the financing issues on spec because they got plenty of money and can raise money with low cost of capital. So I think that's an interesting phenomenon that I'll be interested to see how it plays out.
yeah, I agree.
The other demand side issue that intuitively seems to play a big role is immigration. So we have about, you've mentioned we've had a structurally underinvesting in housing for a long time, going back decades. And yet, we've had kind of a pedal to the metal immigration policy. So we have about 50 million foreign born people living in the country, which does not include US born children of immigrants. We're bringing in about a million. I think we have about a million legal immigrants per year, plus or minus. We certainly had a large surge in illegal immigrants under Joe Biden. In some cities like New York, 40% of the housing in New York is roughly is occupied by immigrants because it's about a 40%. And, again, the exact parameters there. And I think we only build something like 1.4 million housing units per year. Maybe I'm getting that wrong. Or maybe it's 2 million. We don't build that many housing units in America per year. Isn't immigration a major factor in housing prices?
Well, it's important to note we don't build that many housing units anymore, right? We used to. We used to build, between 15 and 20 million housing units a decade, right? So we used to build a lot more than we do now. Now we build something like, 800, 900,000 on average per year, right? 8 to 9 million over the last decade. And so the rate of building has collapsed. And so any sort of demand in that context, sure, given that the supply is being held back. But I would say that what does a healthier U.S. economy look like? One where we've cut demand so much that population growth is close to zero, and then we build that lower, so to accommodate the lower supply, or do we have a larger supply that accommodates the demand? And I would say that it's the latter. We want to focus on building supply. Part of the issue is also that, like, when we're talking about issues that matter, that for you know a high level of importance for prosperity in the U.S. Uh, if you tried to push immigration to zero, you would end up with all these other problems that are really bad for the country. You would end up with a really high dependency ratio, right? You have way smaller workforce supporting many more seniors. You have a lot of the country, even more than we have now, that has population outright falling. And as a resident of the Midwest, you know how the declining population can manifest itself in problems that are a lot more painful than growing population. Your tax base begins to erode. Your schools start cutting off programs because they can't afford to finance them anymore. So decline is a bigger problem than constrained growth. And I think if we were to get rid of immigration, we would have a lot more decline. Uh, Also, in the long run, the construction industry, a lot of them are immigrants. It's one of the highest farm-born share workforces. So that's something that would mitigate that fact in the long run. I agree that in the short run, if you cut immigration to zero, that you would reduce demand for housing more than you would reduce supply. But in the long run, you are going to reduce construction employment, and that is going to be something that pushes against that. So I think we should just get back to the kind of economy we used to have, where we used to have a lot faster growing population. It's not the case like yes, we have immigration today, but population grows at half the pace it used to, less than half the pace. So it's not that we are failing to accommodate a rapidly growing population with a healthy building. It's that we're not accommodating even a slow growing population. That's how slow building has gone. So I think we should focus on that quantity supplied versus quantity demanded, or we're going to end up with a lot of other nasty problems.
Yeah, well, I appreciate you saying that because I see a lot of people, and I saw this in a reply to my tweets. They just deny that immigration has anything to do with housing prices, and I think my view of when it comes to immigration is the vast majority of immigrants to the United States are great people, and I'm not like the hater on immigrants. Of course, we have look when you have 50 million of anybody, you got a lot of bad apples in there, right? It's not just one or two, but at the same time, the vast majority of them are great people who are doing work and often have very inspirational stories. And I think you could agree that immigration is good, but I think we also have to admit that I think we haven't really talked about like the costs of immigration, and I think housing is one of them where we have kind of run into this a little bit, and it seems like people don't want to talk about that. But so I appreciate your kind of perspective on it. Here's the one other I think I was going to bring up earlier. Why are there no large builders? And it seems to me that this is a hypothesis, so it would have to be tested. It seems to me that one reason may be the fact that the housing industry is so dependent on undocumented immigrant labor. Large corporations basically have to operate by the book. They can't go hire people down at the Home Depot parking lot and pay them in cash under the table. And when you end up in a situation where the competitive marketplace is set by essentially, an undocumented labor paradigm, it's very difficult to go into that with sort of a completely legit model. And even in areas like you look at other areas, like I know there's some like meat packing where they've busted a lot of these companies, but even in the New York Times just did a great story on this. Even like warehousing, the the brand name that's on the side of that warehouse, they probably don't own the warehouse. They probably don't operate the warehouse. They probably don't hire any of the workers in the warehouse. It's like there's these staffing firms that special. So they've built these layers of outsourcing in that allow them to hire all these undocumented workers. And I think if we want large builders, kind of large institutionalized professional operations, in a sense, it has to be, you know, legalized labor. It could be immigrant labor, but it can't be people who are like undocumented or being paid cash under the table. In a sense, when you're operating in that paradigm, um, and with no productivity growth in that, and no obvious idea that scale gives you huge learning curve advantages or something, it seems to me that this encourages a fragmented market.
It's
I don't know if you
interesting.
have
I
any thought
mean,
on that's just a hypothesis. I'm wondering what you
yeah.
think of that.
No, I mean that's definitely an interesting theory. I could see that being one possible upside of an amnesty deal that it does allow bigger firms in those sectors where you have more illegal immigrants. Could totally believe that's a possible you know possible benefit of legalizing illegal immigrants. But you point out that like in other industries they manage to get around that with contracting sort of, and obviously there's a lot of contracting even with large firms in the construction industry. So you'd think they would kind of manage to get around it there, and in the construction industry it is compared to other industries you have less large firms. So it's possible. It's possible. I wouldn't imagine it's most of it, but I think it could be a helpful factor. Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. My wife, uh, still in some social media groups from moms groups from the Upper West Side of New York, and there was an interesting post from someone, a plea for help from someone who was trying to hire a nanny. And I'd say 90+% of nannies on the Upper West Side are immigrants. I don't know how many are legal versus illegal. But she's like, I can't find a nanny because I interview people and they're great and I want to hire them. But when I tell them I will insist on paying on the books, they won't work for me. And in fact, even if I offer to true up the taxes or whatever, people were free. So I don't know what it is. Is it Gresham's law that bad money drives out good? I think sometimes it's bad labor practices drive out good. And it becomes very difficult to operate in a legitimate model, even if you want to. Once something becomes dominated by, like, you couldn't start a meat packing plant that hired like all legitimate labor with good working conditions and things like that. So I think we have to get in a situation where it's the other thing where Ford's $5 a day wage makes everybody else have to elevate their game, and then that kind of creates a positive, good labor practices drive out bad dynamic. But I think we have this in different little industries, pockets
It,
here and there.
but we have to keep in mind what the solution is. If the solution is to get rid of the labor that's in the industry, right, through deportations or whatever, you're not going to make it more accessible, right? Like you may, even if you pull in a few more legal workers, right, by removing the undocumented supply, you're not going to make it. You're not going to increase the quantity on the whole. You're going to replace a small fraction of those who you kick out. So I certainly agree that the economy works better when things are above board and workers are legal. But I think if the path to that is via deportations and trying to remove, 10 million people from the economy, that's going to end up with more scarcity, fewer employers. You won't get a sort of good legal economy replacing the bad. You'll get like nothing and higher prices. And so I think that there's some truth in what you say, but we have to think hard about what the path out of that problem is.
Well, I don't want to for any more on immigration. We can do another podcast on immigration someday. I want to talk a little bit about solutions. I mean, I don't know how much time we got here. We don't have to quit at any particular time from my end, but you can tell me if you're running out of time. But I want to talk about
No,
some
I'm
of
good.
the solutions. So there's a couple that have been out there, and maybe you can describe what they are and how they relate. One is this movement called YIMBYism. Yes, in my backyard. It's for the opposite of NIMBY, for not in my backyard, of the people that oppose these projects. And YIMBYism is sort of like a liberalized zoning. That's what I call movement. And then there's the abundance agenda, or you could think of it as supply side progressivism, which is based on the Abundance book by Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson, and it's basically like we need to build more of everything. We need to have that. So, how would you describe these and how they relate, and what you think the role of those is in the housing market, and so, as a solution, as a proposed solution?
So I think YIMBYism is best described as sort of a grassroots type thing. There are a lot of local chapters, a lot of energetic young people, and they are getting involved in state and local politics and pushing for deregulation of housing markets and better regulation of housing markets at the state and local level. It's something that I feel like conservatives should just be thrilled about. I mean, think about like 10 years ago, if you were to say what is the like political group that's animating young people today and getting young people involved in politics, it would have been like democratic socialists pushing for a ubi, uh, and now instead it's like deregulatory focus. So it's amazing to me to see a lot of people, especially a lot of young people, who are really echoing sort of older libertarian neoliberal stories about how lots of little regulations, even if they seem small and maybe well-meaning and maybe marginal, they accumulate into bigger problems. Ultimately, that's what I think this is. It's an energetic, uh, local and highly involved movement that's taking that old libertarian story and putting it into practice. To me, that's something to be excited about. It's really really great to see. Um, and it's improving on the margins across the country, although there's still a lot of work to do. Abundance is more of a intellectual sort of national movement. I would say you have Derek Thompson, Ezra Klein. It's related to work from Tyler Cowen, related to the ideas of increasing supply. And again, like I think conservatives should be excited about this. You have liberals focused on the supply side. That's such a huge improvement from liberals who are focused on let's get to prosperity through fiscal stimulus and the minimum wage, right? Like that this is let's increase the amount of stuff that we build. It's very often focused on specific deregulatory items. And in Ezra and Derek's book, they talk about like unions driving up costs through labor standards and stuff like that. The conservative can say that they don't go far enough, or that they um, are missing some insights there, but I see those as being positive developments for progressivism to be leaning into the supply side, to be leaning into deregulation, and it makes me hopeful.
Yeah, I say YIMBY in my maybe I'm interested in you think of this. My observations, it's about 80% young lefties in places like Brooklyn and California very heavily, although spreading around the country, and then 20% sort of Mercatus style, kind of more libertarian inflected kind of people on the right. Is that ratio at all close? Also relatively
I
young.
don't know what the numbers are. I bet it varies a lot on the ground depending on
Yeah.
whether you're in Montana or whether you're in Brooklyn. But there are definitely, the Mercatus guys are in there. There's a lot of libertarian oriented guys in there, and I think they are very libertarian inflected ideas. So that's not surprising.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that I think the key is that there's a left YIMBYism and a right YIMBYism, And I think that they vary somewhat. I think that the right YIMBYism does tend to be more deregulatory. I think that the left YIMBYism, which as you know, I'm kind of a critic of that movement, even though I probably agree with 80% of the substance of it. A lot of the left YIMBYs, in my view, are sort of it's the same old kind of anti-suburban, dense transit development paradigm we've been talking about since the 70s, because many of them actually want to continue these urban growth boundaries and the like. They don't really want to let cities sprawl. They don't support that. If you don't support sprawl, then I have trouble kind of like thinking it's a deregulatory agenda. So that's like there's a little things there, but I think clearly, certainly in many of these states, we have to do something to make it easier to build. There are too many barriers to building in, again, under the general regulatory heading. And I think there's a lot we could figure out how to do. The single stair reform, I think, is a good one. Why don't you tell us about the single stair reform?
Yeah, it's a
If you know
that's
anything about that one.
yeah, that's so this is a lot of this comes from Stephen Smith, who was a writer for Market Urbanism, um, and now he has a pro building think tank, and he's one of the influential voices on this, but there have been others as well. It's really about reforming building codes, and the idea is that they make you have two stairs, two stairwells as a method of egress for a multifamily housing, and that you should really be able to just have a single stairwell for a multifamily building. And this it turns out to be a pretty important driver of costs, and not just because you build a stairwell, an extra stairwell, and that costs money, and that takes up square footage, and that reduces the amount of square footage that you can rent, so it reduces the profitability of the building. But it has all these effects on the way you actually build the building. You have wider corridors, so it has all these negative downstream effects compared to just having the single stairwell. So it's a really fun example where you get into the weeds of these technocratic little issues, and it's like the old libertarian story. It's like pebbles in a stream. No individual pebble is going to be changing the path of the river, but you have enough pebbles in the stream, and the path of the river will be blocked or changed. Single stairs, but the single stairwell reform can be removing one of those pebbles.
Yeah, and this one has actually got a lot of traction in the market. And this is where I think is more interesting. Most of the debates seem to be over. You often hear like builders, oh, they make us put brick instead of this, and you're raising up the cost because you mandate brick. When maybe the big driver of housing has nothing to do with brick. It's the other one Stephen Smith found was the elevator codes. Like our elevators are massively more expensive than they are in Europe. We have another case of American exceptionalism where we're massively more expensive than the whole rest of the world. In fact, there's one set of elevator standards that governs the entire world, and then there's another one that's just for the United States,
Yep.
basically, and maybe like Canada and Mexico. It's kind of crazy, and we're way more expensive.
A lot of it's this safetyism where people are afraid that if a fireman's going to yell at them that they're going to end up with causing deaths from fires. People are afraid to fight back against that and say, well, no, the costs aren't worth the benefits, or there's other ways to reduce the risk. And so that's why you end up with these really large elevators, so you can fit the full stretcher in them. That's why you end up with needing two sets of stairwells, and all these other little death by a thousand cuts.
Yeah. So we have that, and I think abundance is kind of a more general thing. And I have said many times that I think what I call it the technocratic neoliberal center left, which is where I would put those guys, probably have the closest thing to a program that could be actually adopted as a kind of a political approach. So we'll see what comes out of that. But right now, it seems more principles kind of based, if you will. The other thing, the other thing about YIMBYism, which I think is interesting, and maybe I'm over-indexing on Matthew Iglesias over this, but I know it's true of some others as well. The YIMBYism approach has been driven very heavily by state preemption. So the idea is to get state legislatures to override local zoning codes to say things like anywhere you can build a home, you can build a 4 unit apartment building. Or anybody can build what's called an accessory dwelling unit, which is like a granny flat above your garage that could be there. And so, but there does seem to be, to me, a very anti-localist, anti-communitarian type of ethos. It's very top down. I think Iglesias would say he thinks land use policy should be set at the state level. Another YIMBY person told me he was opposed to localism as a matter of principle. And so I think there is a sense in which they have a paradigm that goes beyond um, kind of the regulation of housing itself and sort of like rewriting the norms of society in general, which may be a good thing. Apparently in a lot of countries, land use is handled at the national level. Japan, for example, but it's sort of opposed to our sort of system that we've had very distributed. I'm wondering if you have like if that aligns with your observation of it. It seems to me like it's a kind of a very let's just shift decision making up in the hierarchy and disempower localities as a matter of general principle.
So it's very interesting. I like the way Alex Armlovich in Niskanen describes it, which is that, you know, it's actually a push for greater localism. If you Because instead of giving, who decides what gets to built somewhere? Should it be the municipality here, or the state at the higher level? No, no, no. Let us go even more local to the individual who owns the property. What could be more localism than letting an individual choose what gets to build, right? And that might sound a little trolly, but I do think that in a lot of other contexts, conservatives would like agree with that, right? Like if you had like a municipality or like a city who was determining what could be taught in private schools, right? And instead we said, no, 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 the state is going to prevent municipalities from doing that. We would agree that that is increasing local control, right? It's letting the individuals control. And so I do think we sort of we sort of get stuck to take for granted that the city is like that has some sort of natural rights over these kinds of decisions. But I think you can make the case to push even localer to the individual. But uh, holding aside that sort of rhetorical argument, one of the things that I've pushed for at EIG is a policy we call density zones. And what this does is it gives the localities the choice to opt into federal control in particular areas. So essentially, you would tell municipalities would get to circle areas on their map, particular blocks, and say within this block, we're going to sort of give up local control. And in place, you will have a standardized zoning and building code, which is sort of akin to what the Japanese do. The Japanese have sort of a menu of zoning, multifamily, mixed use, single family, whatever. There's a federally defined zoning code, and the municipality gets to pick from that menu. And so we're saying federalize this one particular option. Here's like a maximally by right zoning code, but let municipalities implement it. And the carrot will be if there is enough building in that block, then you sort of give that municipality an impact fee paid for by the federal government. And that kind of gets back to your earlier point about the real costs of building, right? How municipalities will often incur serious costs of building. And so they have these impact fees they charge developers. So the federal government will say, look, if you will give up local control and allow for maximum by right building, again, in particular, just blocks, you pick the blocks, then we will compensate you with the impact fees. And I think what's nice about this is you sort of combine the best of both worlds. The federal government defines the maximum amount of by right, frictionless zoning building code policy possible, and the municipality decides where to implement that, if at all. It's completely optional. They don't have to implement it at all. To me, this is making the best of local control, but then sort of federal rulemaking.
Yeah, I think something that looks at zones is better. I guess the other thing I don't like about YIMBY is the whole plan is to essentially make it illegal to have any single family subdivisions anywhere. Whereas I think we could start with zones and let's make them more dense there. And I'm the guy that's gone to the city council meeting, in Evanston, Illinois, to say we need to build 8-story apartment buildings on Chicago Avenue. But I think of the idea that, like, well, we shouldn't be saying we're going to build that everywhere. We should start with some zones and then kind of a build out from that one. So I think the idea of making it more district based, or things less, rather than just kind of a flat, we're going to blow everything away at the
Yeah.
full level. It'll be interesting to see. Do you think, my last question on this, and I want to kind of move on because I know we're kind of going along here. I'm hearing that there might be a ballot in it. California has passed a lot of laws and maybe passing laws of these YIMBY varieties. But I'm hearing that there might be a ballot initiative to essentially blow all those away. Is there a real risk that's going to happen?
I can't speak to the, California specific regulations and stuff there. I would say that I do think that, well, I sort of support the ongoing efforts of YIMBYs everywhere to improve zoning in every sort of neighborhood. But I think while we fight those battles, it's good to look for areas of compromise, right? And with density zones, you sort of focus on those areas of compromise, and so that's sort of the motivation there, is like to have the battle on two fronts. Let's not to your point, not every single family neighborhood is going to opt into reform. And so if you're forcing them to join the battle, they're obviously going to be on the side of blocking reform. Let them be taken off the table. I'll let them take themselves off the table, focus on the specific zones. But yeah, I can't really speak to, what approach California is going to be taking in upcoming initiatives.
Well, we had opportunity zones, density zones. It sounds very on brand for EIG here. What other things besides the zoning side do you think we need to do? Like, specifically, how do we deal with the construction issue? Because that seems to be a huge issue. So, economist Mike Hicks here in Indiana, he's kind of contrarian versus the housing build people. He's like, the market's telling us not to build housing because the current market price of housing in most of the state of Indiana is still below the cost of construction. Therefore, the market is not going to supply any housing. And so increases, this is where, like, when you start having increased demand, it's going to drive housing prices up to the point at which they reach construction cost, even in a theoretically ideal world before we would construct any. So how do we, I'd love to hear your thoughts on construction and then whatever else you have beyond that.
So the easiest things to do are to sort of get rid of tariffs on inputs into construction. Tariffs on Canadian softwood lumber, I mean, give me a break. Like, we're going to care about prioritizing outcomes for, US lumber mills over the cost of housing. Just seems like completely backwards priorities. So I would look for anywhere where protectionism is driving up prices, and certainly like tariffs on, steel and aluminum are heading in the wrong direction. So to whatever extent that we've had problems there, those problems are only going to get worse. So I would, reverse and move away from as quickly as possible tariffs that are raising costs for construction. In terms of the productivity, other than improving the zoning stuff, I don't know what you can do more than continue to study it. It's until we figure out what's going on and hope for some bigger firms. I would love to see sort of like more uh, research centers dedicated to construction industry, construction best practices, trying to move the productivity frontier forward. It's not an area where we think about like, okay, we need to do R&D here. But R&D is the way in which productivity advances in a lot of industries. So are we missing institutes of R&D in the construction industry? um, those are the kinds of questions I would be asking. But it's tough. It's tough when you do have so much of it that's mysterious. So all we can do is sort of get out of the way on the easy things, and then start to think about whether we're missing some institutions on the harder things.
Is there anything we need to do on, think of it broadly as place based policy? It seems like a lot of the original YIMBY discourse has been very fueled by the idea that we need to allow more people to live in San Francisco because the current market is inhibiting talent agglomerations in San Francisco, and that is killing our GDP. So there was a study, I can't remember the name of the study, it was Moretti and was it Shea, is like, we're losing 3.6% of GDP because people can't afford to move to San Francisco. And the idea being, if I'm in a low productivity city like St. Louis, if I could move to a high productivity city like San Francisco, obviously I become more productive, GDP goes up. I think the flip side of that argument is why are there only two places or three places in the whole country everyone wants to move? That's an exaggeration, of course. New York, San Francisco, LA, Washington, Seattle, a few of these places. And then you have places like St. Louis, which are relatively stagnant. And it seems like, on the one hand, economic opportunity is so unevenly distributed that it has kind of pernicious effects on the housing market. Everybody wants to be to the places that are successful. And then the other thing you hear a lot of is, working class culture has become so dysfunctional, everyone wants to isolate themselves from it. It's not just even isolating from racial minorities. Like, we don't want to be around the white working class anymore either because they're, taking too many drugs and doing all this stuff. It's like, the housing prices are about building fortresses around essentially the upper middle class. And so, are there ways that we increase the desirability of neighborhoods that are currently considered undesirable, and then like cities? Is that even like conceptually a way to think about the problem, or is the right way to think about, let's make New York into like the soul of the United States, where like it becomes a dominant primate city in the sense of a London or a Paris?
You know, maybe this is the coward's way out, but I'm going to say yes to both, I guess. I would love for New York to be able to become an even larger megapolis, competing on global standards with the biggest cities that we have. But I also strongly believe that we need more tent poles of agglomeration throughout the country. If you look at a place like Columbus that's doing quite well, I think that's really important for people who live in the region to know that they can have access to the benefits of agglomeration without having to move to the coasts. I think having opportunity close by, growing up adjacent to opportunity, growing up where your community's ties to a high opportunity metro are tighter in a way that you're not going to have from the interior of the country to the coast. I think that's really important. There's a lot of stuff we can point to here where people move to cities, they upskill, they build a network, they start companies, and then you have sort of return migration to the places that they came from throughout the states. And I think that's really important source of prosperity, and it's an important source of opportunity. And if you take all the entrepreneurs and you concentrate them in a handful of coastal cities, you're not going to be getting the best out of your assets in the rest of the country. Like, part of what entrepreneurs do is they come to a place and they say, okay, here are the assets, here are the workers, here are the empty buildings, here are the plots of land, here are the institutional factors. How do I put these to their highest and best value? And I think we need people like that all over the country. And tent poles of agglomeration, high skilled people throughout the country is really important for getting the most out of everybody and giving everybody a lot of opportunity. And giving people opportunity is pro growth. If you have someone who has a tremendous abilities and capabilities, and they are born into a place where they're not connected to a network of highly successful people, they don't learn about opportunities for success, ways to be successful, how to navigate the world of high human capital industries. And I think we need to have those connections. And I think we need to that's sort of the case for not just concentrating everything in a handful of coastal cities. And obviously, my preferred policy prescription for this is heartland visas, which I know we've talked about in the past, allowing high skilled immigrants to move to the parts of the country that are struggling, that are left behind. I think that's an important way to ensure that we do have sort of high human capital, entrepreneurial, innovative people spread more evenly throughout the country.
I want to. This might be my last question. It's something I forgot to ask you about earlier. We're going through the causes, popular people's causes, which is, we've had, certainly since the financial crash, very large monetary and fiscal stimulus. We printed a huge amount of money through quantitative easing, and we had extremely large stimulus bills, multiple extremely large stimulus bills during the Biden administration, Trump administration, during coronavirus. And clearly, I think it's now basically acknowledged that too much fiscal stimulus contributed to inflation, general inflation in the country. Although with inflation, in theory, your incomes and things adjust too. Did this sort of like monetary and fiscal stimulus play a role in where we got to on housing?
Yeah, I think they did. I think that the huge amount of income that people had from fiscal stimulus, very low rates, I think these things did play a role in sort of boosting housing demand, sort of shocking it. Um, I'd love to see efforts to reduce interest rates, both via. I mean, I think the Fed's a little behind the curve in terms of cuts, and that would be helpful. But I think that you know, having a sort of bipartisan attempt to reduce the deficit, things that reduce the risk of the U.S. government. I do think that the sort of volatility of policy over the last 6 months a year has pushed up long run interest rates as well. There's like a risk premium now that we don't need to have. So I think addressing making the fiscal situation more sustainable in the long run will be helpful, and getting the risk out of macro policy and sort of that would be helpful too.
Are there any final thoughts you have on housing? Anything I didn't ask you about, or things you want to pitch or put out there?
No, we got to talk about all my pet policy ideas. So I really appreciate the conversation, Aaron. I think that that in particular the question of like how do we think about agglomeration and how do we think
Hmm.
about the rest of the country, I know is something you spend a lot of time thinking about. So I enjoy talking about that issue. I think it gets not enough discussion.
The reality is I get in trouble a lot here in the Midwest when I tell people that, like, you know, New York City is playing a game that you're not in, and you're just, there are levels to the game you don't know about, and it really is like wild, the incredible disparities in terms of like how things function between these cities. And you know was just an article in the paper about JP Morgan's 2.5 million square foot headquarters in Midtown Manhattan. They're going to put 10,000 workers there 5 days a week. Citadel's building a 1.6 million square foot tower that's next door. It's like, and you come to the average city and it's like, oh, how do we convert these things to apartments? And so, not that New York doesn't have a problem, but there are challenges to dynamism in a lot of these places. In part, because they're, the people that live there. If you want to be dynamic, you leave. That's a
Yeah,
problem. So that
yeah.
could be a topic for another one. Like how to make some of these places more dynamic. Seems like in theory there's opportunity that we're not seizing, but
Absolutely. And I think that the other reason that's important is because, like, if you want advanced manufacturing, what you need is both highly capable, highly skilled, innovative people, and also relatively low cost and ability to build. You're never going to have that in New York City, right? Not anymore. Like, used to be that they manufactured a lot of stuff in New York City, IBM and whoever located in New York City, computer assembly, stuff like that. It's just not the case anymore. So we need places where you can agglomerate lots of skilled, innovative, scientific minds, good universities, but also still afford to build these huge manufacturing facilities. And I think that's it's never going to be in the superstar cities, and so that's a reason why it's important from a U.S. perspective that we have those thriving second tier cities, those thriving Midwestern cities, and places that are just always going to be a lower cost.
all right. My guest today has been Adam Ozemeck. He is the chief economist at the Economic Innovation Group. I will throw a link to EIG and to Adam's Twitter in the show notes. Adam, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me.